Now, on to what you're really here for, which is for me to briefly introduce my friend and colleague, Bill Peck, who is going to talk about daily life in ancient Egypt, a fresh look. He's also going to give us an update on activities today in the Great Archaeological National Museum in Cairo, so that's a special extra treat. Bill is wearing a suit tonight, but this is more often what his friends and colleagues get to see him looking like, and I think you'll recognize him wearing one of his many hats. He will talk, I hope at least briefly, about the fact that for a very long time he has been an extremely important member of the excavation team at the Temple of Mut at Luxor, and you'll know more about that. If you are intrigued, look up the website. That's all I can say because it has day-to-day accounts of what's been happening. Bill, of course, also, like Kurt, writes books. And his first famous book, called Drawings from Ancient Egypt, was the very first book by him I picked up way back. I was no longer a graduate student, though I wasn't quite that young. But it's an extraordinary book. We have a copy in the library, and I don't have a cover for it because I didn't have time to scan the beautiful cover. Instead, what I've illustrated there is an amazing Ostrakhan drawing which is currently on loan to the Egypt Experience Secrets of the Tomb. Go take a look at it. It is a working drawing by at least two artists, one of whom was sketching a Ramesside king, and the other of whom was drawing a cartoon about two of his either friends or colleagues, a priest named Hagar, a priest named something, and his wife. And the names are written on the label, and they just flew out of my head, sorry. In the middle is a fantastic book. For those of you who, like me, are passionate about museums, every museum has a different personality. And Bill Peck was the person who wrote the biography of the Detroit Institute of Arts. It is funny, heartbreaking, and beautifully illustrated, so enjoy it. And in 1997, Bill did something that inspired a lot of us. For almost 6 months, he hosted a very important Egyptian art show from the Polizius Museum in Hildesheim, Germany, at the Detroit Institute of Arts. I think I went 6 times. I wish I'd gone more because it was an amazing show. And Bill wrote a book that I admired so much because it addresses all the general questions people have about Egypt in an intelligent and approachable manner. So that when I decided it was time we had to think about writing our own book for Toledo, I didn't think that was a model because it was perfect. Instead, I thought it was something that we could aspire to imitate in the best possible way to create our own book. And this is our book. So applaud with me, please. And you're so kind to do that because the people you have applauded are not only Bill Peck, but a triple handful of my colleagues who worked extremely hard to make this possible. Many of them are here tonight. Paula Wright was the production manager and editor. Andrea Mall was the registrar who supervised photography. We had a visiting photographer named Richard Goodbody who was brilliant, fast, funny, and easy to work with. Tim Motz, who is here, helped answer questions endlessly. And Julia Hayes, who is helping manage this program tonight, and her colleagues managed photography, scanned things, and handled an incredible number of details. So we have really benefited from a staff that has loved its collection for a very long time in order to create a book that we truly hope you will enjoy. And tonight is your opportunity to have the author, Bill Peck, sign it.
I prefer this title, Life and Living, because if you Google the title, Daily Life in Ancient Egypt, you'll find something like 15 or 20 books with the same title. It's a very pop. Some of them have subtitles that differentiate them one from the next. Many of them have exactly this title, not this title, but Daily Life in Ancient Egypt. We know a great deal about daily life, but we don't know anything typical. Remember that we're dealing with a history that is beyond 3,000 years old, that included a population that may have been as large as 3 million people at some times. It's very hard to even estimate the population. What we have to deal with are 3 kinds of evidence. The evidence of illustrations in tombs, relief carvings and paintings, the evidence of the objects found in tombs, and written evidence. The written evidence sometimes is the most revealing because we have actual documents that are bills and memoranda and letters and so on, which bring us close to what may be like daily life. The paintings and relief carvings on tomb walls are somewhat more remote because they illustrate ideal situations, and as well as the objects found in tombs, which are also somewhat ideal. And you have to remember that, and this is why I think that this is a kind of fresh look, one of the things we tend to forget is most of our evidence for daily life comes from the tombs of the elite. So what the ordinary peasant in the field lived like in ancient Egypt is very hard to even suggest. We know it was a life of unremitting labor. We know that ancient Egypt was an agricultural land and that the greater part of the population subsisted as field workers, as agricultural workers. We know that it was probably a situation where people rose with the sun and went to bed when it set. If you've ever walked into a village before electricity and saw that it was absolutely pitch dark and that people couldn't be going about any kind of activity, you would get some sense of what it must have been in antiquity, because they depended so much on the sun rising and setting, and the sun literally, of course, became a god to the Egyptians because it was the generating factor of all life. But as far as knowing how the peasant lived, we have some evidence that's also somewhat remote. Most of these books that deal with, or purport to deal with ancient daily life in ancient Egypt, base a lot of their evidence on two, I might as well show you something interesting instead of a title. They base their evidence on two particular sites, and some of the material that comes out of those sites is interesting and illuminating and tells us a great deal. One of them is a site near the Fayum Depression in northern Egypt called El Lakun, which was a workman's village, and I'll show you a plan of it later, but a workman's village constructed, a temporary settlement constructed for people working on pyramids. The other is a famous site called Deir el-Medina, which is at Thebes in the south, which was also a workman's village. And I'm just reading yet one more book on daily life, and the author said until the beginning of the 20th century, we all thought that the evidence from Deir el-Medina told us about the poor, the lower classes. In fact, Deir el-Medina was, as I said, a workman site, but they were very high-level workmen. They had most of their needs taken care of by the government. Water, food, all the things that they needed were allotted to them. They didn't have to go out and scramble for a living because they were employed on digging the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. So we do have evidence of a lot of the aspects of daily life, but it's still not the lower classes. It's not the elite, so to speak, but it does get a little bit lower in the spectrum of social situations. But we do know a few ideal things. We know that the basic building block of Egyptian society was the family. And family was very important in many aspects. There was no social situation that took care of the aged and the infirm and so on, except the family. So the extended family was very much a reality in ancient Egypt, where the widowed and the ancient aunts and so on were part of this extension, and they contributed their labor and so on. Women had an ideal situation in Egypt, and many people say that in antiquity, Egyptian women were better off than most other places in the ancient world. They could own property, they could deed it to their descendants, they could divorce their husband. And divorce was a matter of writing, getting something passed by through a legal situation. Although there's no record of what marriage was. Whether there was an official ceremony for marriage, we don't really know. However, this was simply to illustrate the happy family, and that's essentially what it is. Father, mother, and 4 children, and a priest who may or may not be a member of the family. So we have lots of illustrations of this family relationship, especially man and wife, in what we in the trade call pair statues. Sometimes they show very tender relationships. This is probably the earliest example. It's King Mykerinus and his maybe wife. If you read most textbooks, they very quickly tell you that this was a woman called Nefertiti, who was his wife and queen. Well, there's no evidence for that. There's no inscription on the statue, and the chances are just as good that this is a goddess, not his wife at all. And there are other evidences, there are clues to this. However, it is a pair statue, and it becomes the prototype for many pair statues of private people later on. However, the hierarchy in the family, the male was the predominant and important person. As you see, the female, the wife on the right and the child on the left, are obviously not as important. In ancient Egyptian art, the hierarchy of size was pretty blatant. The important people were larger, and the less important people were not quite so large. And this is even mentioned, I think, in our book. And I say our because although I'm listed as the author, I had a lot of assistance in the way that it eventually ended up. This is a triad of 3 people in the statue that was in an exhibition that I had at the DIA. And one Egyptologist read the inscription and said, well, the man's name is Pepi and the woman's name is such and such, I can't remember, and there's a child. Well, actually, the woman's name is Pepi. And she seems to be more important in this because she's a little taller and she's embracing a man who may be her husband or maybe her son. We're not quite sure. The inscription doesn't tell us. But this illustration of family even extends to royalty. This is a king and his mother. So there are many ways that this can be illustrated. This is one of my favorites, and I show it to you because it's a New Kingdom example. And I show you a very famous one from the tomb of Ramosa, which is literally one of my favorite works of art in the whole world. And I show the 2 of them together because the one on the right is a 2-dimensional rendering of the same kind of context that you see on the left. When you look at the relief carving on the right, you think that the woman is seated behind the man. But in fact, this is the Egyptian way of showing side by side. So they're still a loving couple. She's still embracing him. And if you look carefully on the far right, you see her fingers around his shoulder. Now, you say, that's not ancient Egyptian, what's it doing in here? Well, I'm going to explain a little bit about that. These formal portraits of the pair statues are no less formal than the photographs that we know from family albums, perhaps of the 19th century. And the illustration is pretty graphic because the American photograph shows the couple in their Sunday go-to-meeting dress with their hair very carefully fixed, in their best composure and so on, seated for eternity. The Egyptian statue on the left is exactly the same sort of thing. They're wearing their best wigs. They're seated not to be moved. This is not a snapshot. And this is a representation that's supposed to last. This is even a better example because the couple on the right, you doubt that she ever wore her hair like that in ordinary, everyday life, nor did the Egyptian woman on the left who's wearing a very formal wig. But my point in showing these is that they show you that these statues are not images of daily life. They are very formalized portraits. They're meant to be eternal. And these statues are put into the tomb for exactly that and no other reason. But remember Pepi in the middle who's embracing her son or maybe her husband. Here's a wife who's embracing her husband as if he needs it, and it sort of looks that way. We have some evidence of houses. Here are 2 models and a painting from a papyrus, and those triangular things on the roof of the house in the papyrus are air scoops. they're a way of bringing fresh breezes down into the upper story. And I hope you can see this line drawing because it's one of the evidences from a tomb painting that show you houses could be 3 stories high. In the basement, people are engaged on weaving. This is a handicraft, home craft, and there are all sorts of things going on. The master of the house is being presented with a drink, and servants are walking up the stairs on the far right, and so on. So we have lots of evidence of things that we may not, we don't recognize houses as being in antiquity, in ancient Egypt, as being 3 stories high. However, at Medina Habu, there are still mud brick houses that are 3 stories high. And there's lots of evidence of that. These houses are very late, to be sure. They're Roman period. But they're still one more page of the evidence we have of how people lived. There's a lovely model in the Egyptian presentation here in the museum of one of these so-called soul houses. And they come in lots of shapes and lots of forms, but they're essentially meant for the spirit. They're models for the spirit. This is a model, but it's a modern model of a house at Toledo, the capital that Akhenaten created. And if you look at the model again, you can visualize how it looks in the plan. It's a complicated house, but this is the house of a rather important nobleman, not anybody ordinary, and not giving us really a lot of information about daily life except on an exalted level. There are models like this that show us the courtyard or the garden, the interior of a house, complete with trees and a reflecting pond. So we know that people who could afford it had much more latitude to create a villa, so to speak, with all sorts of appurtenances that the ordinary person couldn't have. We'll see some houses that reflect this. This is the plan of the town at Lebanon that I mentioned. On the left, those sort of beehives are small sort of shotgun apartments for the workmen. On the right, at the top, you see that there are about 6 divisions. Those are houses for the supervisors. And they're blocked off by that heavy wall on the left-hand side. This is a model to visualize, a computerized model to visualize what this must have been like. So even in a temporary structure like a working town that's not going to be occupied after the pyramid is built, there was this social division. This is reconstructed view of houses at Tel el-Amarna, where that model of a villa came from, but it's sort of average people. And this gets us to Deir el-Medina, the place I mentioned that has been used as an example of what daily life was like, except that these people were high-level workmen. They were very skilled craftsmen and artists, and they were government employees. Deir el-Medina is over that hill, and that square object you see on the right is a temple enclosure. But when you get on the other side of the hill, you find the actual village. And the village, this is the plan of it, it sort of grew. Now, I like to say that the Egyptians invented city planning. Other people will disagree with me because they'll say the Greeks did it. But if you go to Giza and you look at the pyramids and you see the tombs laid out at the foot of the pyramids, they're laid out in a grid system. And that's city planning. At any rate, Deir el-Medina sort of grew. There are parts of it which are earlier and others that are later. The houses look something like this. This is actually one of my photographs. And this is a photograph looking right down one of the dwelling places with a series of rooms, one after another. And from some of these, you can see that there were upper floors. There are stairs that take you to the roof. And the reason this is so well preserved is these houses were not made just with mud brick, unbaked mud brick like adobe. They were made also of stone because there was a lot of limestone around. So there was a mixture of brick and stone. And just another view of a couple of the houses side by side. Here's a cross-section of one of them, you were looking straight down one of these houses earlier. And it shows you on the left a sort of antechamber, and in the middle a larger room with a column supporting the roof, a couple of cellars for storing food and other things, and a stairway going up to the roof where cooking was done and where people could get out into the air. One of the things that's missing in the Medina houses, and here's an artist, a reconstruction of the same, are sanitary facilities. That was almost all accomplished out of doors. So, dress, one of the things about the tomb representations that we see are men wearing kilts and going bare-chested. Now, in the climate of Egypt, at any time, it's cold in the winter and it's hot in summer. And the chances are that no Egyptian ran around bare-chested all the time. And so what we have to understand is that we're looking at representations that are formal portraits. This is to show the virility and the masculinity of the man represented. We take it for granted that this is the way Egyptians look because we see so many representations that look like that. But in fact, this is a representation for eternity showing his best qualities and not necessarily how he looked in life. Look at Mycerinus again. He's wearing much the same kind of garment, and the woman next to him, whoever she may be, is wearing a very form-fitting dress that clings and reveals that she's clearly feminine. Tutankhamun and his wife are wearing a variation on garments like that, more elaborate and so on, but no less identified in the same way. Ramesses II wears a slightly more elaborate garment in the New Kingdom, and later garments become more and more elaborate. And you can see in this composite that I made of two, a male and a female of Dynasty 18, which is now 14th century more or less, the garments have become very complicated. And one of the questions we're still asking is how did they put all the pleats in? And how did they keep them in? And they must have used some kind of sizing that we don't know. There are lots of examples of clothing. The tunic on the right is probably the standard garment throughout most of Egyptian history. There are a number of examples in various museums. Shoes or sandals like these, made out of a variety of fibers, come to us, but we think most people went barefoot. Wigs took on a whole variety of different forms, and wigs have two functions. One of them is to keep the head cool and out of the sun, and the other is probably to alleviate the necessity for having to do with head lice, because you can shave your head or whatever. However, in some instances, like the Old Kingdom head on the left, you can actually see her real hair underneath her wig. But these are all wigs, and they are, for the most part, ceremonial. And we have a number of examples that are preserved in various museums. And just to show you how complicated they are, this is a two-part wig in detail on the right. And here's a representation of a princess or a queen having her hair done. She's at the beauty parlor. Food is more interesting than dress in some respects. The Egyptian diet, only for the elite, was probably more meat, a lot of fish, and I like this representation because it shows you two different ways of catching fish, one with a dip net and the other with a multiple hook. So the Egyptians, you might say, invented hooks for catching fish. The variety of foodstuffs was pretty wide, and lots of different kinds of vegetables and fruit. This is a piece in the DIA on the left, and it was something of a mystery, but if you look carefully in the on the right-hand side of the left image, there's the head of a duck just below the bulge in the piece. And if you look at the man on the right from another representation, he's holding the head of a duck exactly in the same way, ready to put it on the pile of foodstuffs. We see a lot of different things in this. At the very top, those curved lines are part of a spare ribs, a whole rack of ribs. We have a number of other different things represented. Basket of figs, what look like cucumbers. There's a lettuce, and these are the longer variety of lettuce, not ball shapes. A number of different ducks and geese, and Patrick Houlihan, who wrote the book on Egyptian birds, tells me only one of the birds in this whole mess can be actually identified as a particular species, and that's the pintail in the middle. So lots of fish and fowl, not so much meat, many vegetables. The only source of sweetening was either honey or dates, no artificial sugars. The ancient Egyptians did enjoy an atmosphere that was not polluted by modern industry, so we don't get too many examples of lung cancer, although the lungs went out of the mummy with all the other embalming steps, so we don't know. Furniture. Furniture for the lower classes was very simple. Three-legged stools. For the upper classes, more elaborate, like this gentleman on a four-legged stool. They had a sampling of furniture from the British Museum, a chair, a stool, and a three-legged table. Two examples, one in the Metropolitan on the right of ivory and ebony. And one, when I saw this in an illustration, I thought, oh yeah, this can't be true. It's a blue-legged chair. Well, if we go back to the Tutankhamun example, he has a blue-legged chair, so it must have been something that was popular in his time. This is a tomb painting from the tomb of Ramosa at Thebes, and also one of my favorites. And it illustrates what had to be taken to the tomb for the benefit of the deceased, of the spirit. A chair balanced on somebody's head, a whole series of chests, boxes that contain jewelry and clothing and so on, and a bed with a headrest. So illustrated there in one simple tomb painting are the necessities for the spirit as far as furniture. This particular detail is interesting because the text between them, down at the bottom, says, mind the pace, get back in step. In other words, when two people are carrying a bed, it's better to be in step. And the artist has been very economical because the man on the left carries the bed and also carries a fan. The one on the right carries the bed and also a box on a strap. And every one of the others are doing 2 and 3 things at the same time. Here are a couple of actual examples of beds. Not all of them retain their stringing. And one in the Egyptian Museum in Turin in northern Italy from the tomb of an architect named Wa. His tomb was found intact with all of the furnishings. Here's his bed with linen folded up as sort of mattress-like material. Linen was a commodity that could be used in trade, so you could buy land with bolts of linen. But it was also taken to the tomb by many people as an example of how wealthy they were. So some tombs had lots of linen. Many burials included a headrest. This one's an alabaster one, which isn't practical, and stools. And one of my favorites, this is a Tutankhamun stool, and I thought, yeah, a leopard skin on a stool. Well, I found a tomb painting that illustrates exactly the same thing. So, simple example of a table, although tables weren't very important to the lower classes because they sat on the floor. They slept on the floor too. And not only chests, but baskets. Many of the things we would put in a dresser, drawer, or a closet or so on ended up in a basket. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, there was something like 60 baskets of clothing and other items like jewelry. This is the contents of a cosmetic chest on the left, the one on the right opened. And this is a little basket that probably belonged to a little girl. And to give you an idea of the size of the basket, that blue ring in the middle is a finger ring. So it's a very small, beautifully designed basket. That object on the far right at the bottom, the spiral-shaped looking one, is an earplug to be put into the earlobe to keep the opening in the lobe open. Games, we all have seen the games included in the Tut tomb, but the architect Wa had the same game, the Senate game, in a much simpler version. The average person would have played the same game with the lines, the squares marked out on a piece of stone, and not anything as elaborate as that. This is an ivory game that's called Hares and Hounds, and when it was found, it was thought that it was something else, not even a game. Now, jewelry, very quickly. Most of the people we see in the representations in ancient Egyptian reliefs and paintings wearing lots of jewelry, like this. This is one of those beaded collars that you see in this relief. Here are jewelers at work, and in the lower register at the bottom, you see on the left one of the collars being made. These are dwarfs who were employed because, I guess, of their small fingers. Here are metal craftsmen and furniture makers, and the tools of the furniture maker, including the bow drill. Bow drill was used not only for making furniture and drilling holes, but that was the way the Egyptians lit their fires. If you've ever been a Boy Scout, you may have used a bow drill to start fire, but that was one of the ways of creating friction in a concentrated area and beginning a fire. They didn't have flint and steel, so this was the best possible. Here are carpenters at work and the carpenter tools. So we have a lot of the material of life in ancient Egypt, whether it's daily life or not. We have carpenters at work in several model representations. We have metalsmiths making, they're handling crucibles, and they're tending charcoal fires. And that big rectangle in the center of the slide is a form for making bronze doors. So, as I said earlier on, our evidence is the representations on tomb walls, the actual objects, and some text that can give us additional information. There are so many representations of workmen that I can't go into all the details, but it's a whole myriad of different activities. Metalwork again. Here, one of my favorites, sculptors working on several different projects at the same time. The ones on the right are carving a granite statue of a king with scaffolding, and at least 5 people working on the same statue. It's a group project. And here, at the other end of that same composition, several people working on a seated statue. So, and this is line drawing of the whole business, with working on a sphinx in the middle and an offering table below that. So we know that these were group projects. I mentioned mud brick earlier on. I've seen with people taking water out of a pond, mixing mud, and putting the mud into molds and laying the bricks out in orderly lines at the upper center of the composition. Here's the same detail, and here's modern mud brick makers making mud brick exactly the same way that their ancient ancestors did. That's actually at the Temple of Mut. Then they take the mud brick and they do a variety of things with it, including building ramps. One of the great mysteries to people is how some of the ancient monuments were built. It was almost entirely with mud brick ramps. And there's the remains of one of them still in Karnak Temple, showing the ramp that was used to build one of the big pylons. I love this one because it's gathering grapes. Remember, these are hardworking agricultural workers who planted the fields, plowed the fields, harvested the materials. And this one trampling on the grapes in a big vat, and they're hanging from straps like subway riders so that they don't slip and fall into the grape mess. And it gets bottled and carried away. And this, to me, summarizes activity of the field workers, because they're going different directions, they're carrying big jugs, it looks like a sort of furor of activity. The models that you've seen include things like workers in carpenter shop and so on, but they also included boats. This is the scene of one tomb when the models were found, and the Metropolitan Museum excavators had to sort all this out, and they ended up with things like this scene of the counting of the cattle, or the pouring of the grain into the bins in a granary, or the tending of cattle, and the slaughtering of cattle, and the making of bread and beer, and the catching of fish, and the sailing pleasantly down the Nile if you were an elite person like the one under the canopy, with a full complement of sailors who measured the depths of the sandbars with a lead at the prow. And ultimately, if you were, again, elite and not, well, even the most lowly workmen probably had music of some kind. And we witnessed early on in our excavation the chants of workmen as they tried to make the arduous task of carrying away the dirt, or a little less arduous, by the call and repeat, where a singer sings a verse and all of the workmen repeat it, often beautifully improvised, often sort of scandalous material about how the director of the excavation sleeps in a bed and I sleep on the floor, that sort of thing. But at any rate, music was a very important part of Egyptian life, and this too is recorded on a tomb wall. So it's a lot in a very short time. It's a sampling only of what we know about life in ancient Egypt, but by no means does it tell us what daily life was really like. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions?
We'll have lights first, if that's okay. If you're desirous of leaving, please do. Question? Yes.
I had heard that because of all the sand, some of their food had
Oh, yes.
a lot of it in and it hurt their teeth. Was that pretty correct?
Did Bob Breyer say that last week?
I don't know. I've heard that in so many places. I wanted your opinion.
I say that somewhat in jest because Bob talked about mummies last week. And yes, mummies often have the molars ground down to flat surfaces where they don't have any kind of articulation any longer because of the grit in the diet. And that came from two places. I used to say it's like having a picnic at the beach. You're apt to get sand in your picnic. However, there's a beautiful model in the Egyptian exhibition of a woman grinding grain on a saddle quern, on a stone surface. And obviously some of the grit from not only the surface, but the implement she's using got into the flour. And yes, I've actually examined mummies that had that kind of dental problem, where they no longer had any kind of variation in the surface of their molars, literally ground down flat. Yes?
I'm curious, have you ever seen any other representation for the eye except a front view on the side of the face?
Oh, yes.
Really? Like a side view?
No, there are representations of frontal faces, faces seen
Okay.
from the front. So that's an interesting problem. When I didn't get into this too much, but the ideal representation in 2 dimensions is a composite, as many of you would recognize, so that you have a profile head and a frontal eye, the most complete views of both. So you take the most complete, most typical view and you combine them, because this is not a snapshot, as I said earlier. It's the image, a symbolic image to last forever. Yes?
Sir, can you tell me, you showed us that really impressive layout of, was it when they were building a pyramid that had, you said it was, you were talking about how it was atypical of, not the poorest of the poor, but more skilled laborers and whatever that were engaged in that long project, so they had to what's the span of years that maybe they would be building that pyramid? And then also, do you know, like when they scooted from pyramids over into the Valley of the Kings and started doing things so that they're a little bit more hidden, how would they do the same kind of setup? Like, would they have that many, the same quantity of people, would be that lengthy of an undertaking?
The construction crew for a pyramid was vastly larger than the construction crew for a tomb cut into the valley walls. There's a lot of conjecture about how long it took. The village that I showed you, which was a construction village for a pyramid built of mud brick, not stone. So it lasted, and well, it might have been sheathed in stone. It might have had a layer of stone, but it's still there. It's almost all mud brick, what's left of it. The village of Medina, where this workman who worked on the Valley of the Kings projects, very complicated. And I mentioned only briefly the fact that the documents help us. And from Medina, there are a lot of documents. We can trace relationships. We can see who lived in what houses at what times. We know that they were organized into 2 work gangs because you can't work on the right and left side of a rock-cut tomb at the same time. So when the right-hand gang was working, the left-hand gang was off. And the villages of Medina then engaged in cottage industries. They made furniture and did other things. However, they were sustained by the state. Medina is in a place where there is no water. So water had to be brought up from the Nile, probably on women's heads. And their food and their garment, they were paid in linen and grain. And if they had a surplus of grain, they could trade it off to somebody else for something else and so on. And there's a lot of documentation. The hierarchy, the master draftsman and so on, the chief of the right-hand gang. So we know a lot about Medina. But we still don't know how long it took to carve a tomb like Seti I, which is one of the largest. It most probably took years, because that's a lot of carving into those limestone walls. That answer your question?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yes, somebody over here. Yes?
What was their vocation in the winter, and what would be their dress like?
Well, what was their vocation in the winter?
What would they do if they were farmers?
They worked on communal projects like pyramids.
But they would be outdoors, would it not? Would it be outdoors necessarily?
Yes.
Or would it be...
One of the things that we have a distorted view of, we know that linen was the chief garment, at least that's what is preserved. But there were wool garments. Not so many have been preserved for the very obvious reason that they're subjected to too many other detrimental factors. However, there are remains of linen garments, and there were even hide, leather used. There were leather sandals, for instance. Most of the sandals we see are made out of papyrus palm leaves, but they probably wore something a little bit more substantial. And the work projects of building pyramids or other public works were done by what we call a system of corvée, that is, draft. And interesting point about that is, when they weren't working on the fields to either plant or harvest, they were subject to the draft. When the system in tombs developed that people didn't want to work in the next life, they created these ever-familiar Shabti figures, those little mummiform figures, and those were meant to substitute for the spirit so that he wouldn't be called up in a draft to work on a communal project. And most of the inscriptions, I'll paraphrase, say something like, "Oh, Shabti, if I am called to do any work in the next life, you answer in my place. If I'm asked to bring sand from the east to the west, clean out the drainage canals, to do thus and so, you answer and take my place." Now, it started out in the Middle Kingdom around 2000 that there was only one of these figures in the tomb, and then it gradually developed that there was one for every day of the year. But the Egyptians, being very practical people, decided that the ordinary workmen needed supervisors. So each corps of 10 got a supervisor, shop team to go, who's dressed a little different. So ultimately, the number, and there's a box full of them up in the exhibition, which illustrates this perfectly. It ended up being over 400 in one tomb. That's why you can go from one museum to another and see shop deeds of the same man. I mean, there are a couple in the collection here in Toledo that I had in Detroit. And if you went to the Ashmolean at Oxford, you would see the same people because they came out of the same excavation. I mean, the same shop deeds from the same tombs because of the quality. Those, yeah.
Death has been symbolically shown by painting the faces green, but they didn't do it on all of the mummies' caskets. How's done?
Slight error. The green is the color that's usually ascribed to the god Osiris. It's the green is one of his typical colors that his face is painted. The colors used symbolically in a variety of ways. First of all, the male is usually a darker color of red-brown. I mean, ordinary males, and females are a yellow-white. And the explanation for that is that the women stayed indoors and the men worked outdoors. And the women wanted to look lighter and paler in complexion. However, when you get to the gods, the god Amun, who was a sky god originally, was blue. The god Osiris was green because he was early on a vegetation god. He was not, first of all, the god of the west and the god of the dead, ruling over the, what we call the underworld, but that's a misnomer. So color can be used, and Osiris is also black sometimes, because that's the black of the fertile soil of Egypt. But that's not the color of death. That's the color of actually rejuvenation and regeneration.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Very happy to clear up all these mistakes.
When a king is portrayed on the wall in a story, does he always look the same? Could you tell it's the same man, or would it be?
Yeah, you can tell, did everybody hear this question, is the king always portrayed the same? Yes, most of the time, with one great exception, and that's Akhenaten, is shown in a variety of different ways. But they're easier to recognize in statues in 3 dimensions than they are in the rooms. Although you wouldn't confuse Tutmosis III with the chapter. Yes, you might confuse them, but you wouldn't confuse Ramesses II, for instance, with the chapter. They look different in the least. The Ramessid kings, as a whole group of them, 11 as I recall, they all tend to look alike. So that brings up another question. The Egyptian art is really part of the language. And one of the questions that came up is, how can you tell the difference between the goddess Hathor and the goddess Isis, who are clearly 2 different deities and have different attributes? They look alike. They're women. The only way you can tell them apart is either what kind of emblem is on their head or what the text says next to them. So you really have to be able to recognize the names of Hathor and Isis to know which one you're looking at, because otherwise they look so much alike that it's hard to differentiate them.
Well, another question that goes along with that, there's a king, he has a flat forehead and an elongated neck. Now, could that possibly be the way he actually looks, or would that
I think you're talking about Akhenaten.
Yes.
We don't know. He probably didn't look quite as handsome as some of the other kings of Egypt. However, if you looked at this period, Akhenaten has good press because he did so many interesting things. But in the early part of his revolution, and he tried to revolutionize not only the religion of ancient Egypt, but the art, he's much more, I would say, I'm hard to describe, exaggerated than later on in his own reign. The head of Nefertiti is much later in the time of Akhenaten, so it's a beautiful head. But if you saw an image of her early on in his reign, she's almost as grotesque as he is. So these things change. I mean, it's a style that changes. And the reason for this is in any revolution, you tend to go overboard. And so the early manifestation of this is much more exaggerated than gradually. There's one way back there, yes.
Okay, so Akhenaten, he had such an exact, like his skull was really, really long also, right?
We don't know.
But his daughters are depicted the same way. Could there have been some sort of,
There's a question
Genetic
about what
deformity?
disease that Akhenaten may have had and whether or not his daughters were just imitating him in art. The problem we have here is we don't have the mummies of any of these people. So we don't know from physical evidence whether this is an artistic convention, whether it's just a way of representing that, maybe trying to make them look smarter because they had a big head. We don't know, because we don't have the physical evidence. And so until we find the body of Akhenaten or Nefertiti or one of those princesses, the closest thing we have is Tutankhamun, who is now people believe to be a son of Akhenaten. That's the prevalent theory, although I'm not absolutely convinced of that at this point. That's one of the nice things about ancient history, it's changing all the time.